forward to this presentation. John Thomas.
It's interesting being actually a presenter at the symposium because back in 2007 we had our first event, and I'm so delighted to see actually a couple of the presenters that presented for us in 2007 here at this event, and that I'm actually having the opportunity to share my own family story. So I learned a lot in this process, as some of us do when we do prepare for these kinds of talks, and hopefully you'll get a kick out of my family's history as well. So my family came from, well actually, interesting, I think it should be fair to mention that it was my grandmother's family that came first, from Zelnice, yeah. Her family came first, but there was not sufficient information to gather that line. But they were actually the first to come to Canada back around the turn of the century. I'm really concentrating on the Jugloff, which is my paternal grandfather's family. And he came from Kosovo, Selobambo, Kosovo, Macedonia. We, as young kids, my brothers and I always heard that. Well, where are you from? Make sure they know that your family's from Bumble. He was very proud of that fact. It was in the 1920s that my family first came, his family first came, and although it was a very common thing for people to leave any part of Europe to come to the United States or Canada, my family was not unique in that, because many immigrants did come to Canada with the intention of actually coming here for a while and then earning some money and going back, and my grandfather was no exception. Although some families as well wanted to establish themselves here first and then bring their family members over. Why Toronto was chosen? It was because there was a small but rather significant Macedonian community forming in Toronto in the since the turn of the century. By the 1920s, life had become increasingly difficult in the South. We all grew up, I'm sure, with stories of very profound oppression from the Greeks, and my grandfather never was shy about expressing his experiences as a child and as a teenager growing up in that part of Aegean Macedonia that was taken over by the Greeks after 1913. Apparently, we would hear stories about how the Macedonians were often given tickets, like traffic tickets, for speaking Macedonian, and my rather tenacious granddaddy, Antanas, was apparently a repeat offender of his law, so he had amassed a number of fines and was quite defiant of the laws of not being able to speak Macedonian publicly. The very first brother to come to Canada from the Jugloffs was actually Chicho Spiro. He came first, we're estimating probably around 1922 or so, and he was followed by his brothers Nam, or we call them Norman, and Nako. And they were the first Jugloffsi to come to the Toronto area. This is a picture of my Chicho Spiro, who I actually didn't know very well, but he was, again, the very first Jugloff to arrive. In 1927, my dedo, Vangel, decided to follow his brothers, and so he was very proud of that journey in that he visited France as a part of that journey. So he took a train from Macedonia right through continental Europe and arrived in France. He's very proud of that fact and reminded us of that. He sailed in a ship from Le Havre and sailed to Gander, Newfoundland, which even wasn't part of Canada at the time. The intention, though, was to join his brothers in the Toronto area, and so he made it his way through land transportation. Again, it's very perplexing, and we kind of wonder, how did they do that? How did they manage with no English or going through through Canada to get to Toronto? It's amazing. So it's a small miracle, but I guess it was rather common practice for people to do that at the time. So this is a picture of my dedo, Vangel Jugloff, in the 1930s. And we often ask my grandmother, why did you marry him? And she would say, "He was so handsome." But that he was just such a good-looking man. Never mind character, hardworking, nothing. It's just the fact that he was a good-looking man. So that's a picture of my dedo in the 1930s. Some people who knew him actually went gray rather early in life. In fact, my aunt says that she didn't even remember him with dark hair. He went white fairly early in his 40s or so. So why, again, was immigration to Canada? Well, he left for mostly economic reasons, as aside from the oppression from the Greeks. And so he left Vumbel at the age of 24. It seemed the obvious destination, Toronto, because of the fledgling Macedonian community that was developing there. And it was much easier to go where you had relatives or friends. So you have to look at those people who first came from Macedonia and had no one to go to, how hardy souls they must have been. Upon arrival in Toronto, he went to work almost immediately. Went for the Swift meat packing plant, and it was my understanding that many immigrants from Macedonia came to work. His brothers were working there when he first arrived, and so he got employment there almost immediately. But my devil wasn't someone who liked to work for someone else. He had an entrepreneurial spirit, so his career at Swift didn't last for more than a few months. Although my Chicho Spiro, the first Jugloff to come to Canada, actually remained at Swift for many years, and that first picture you saw of him actually was him getting an award after, I think, 25 years of service, even though he was involved in the family businesses. But you know what? Opportunities do come up, and Chicho Nako, who was also one of the original Jugloffs who arrived, he had a shoeshine business. So when my dedo was fed up with dealing with carcasses and things like that, being a butcher at the meatpacking plant, he went into business with his brother Nako, and they had a shoeshine business. And again, this was something that many immigrants found as a way for gainful employment. Those people who either couldn't find work, or they just wanted to go into business on their own. So shoeshine business was very common amongst immigrants in Toronto, particularly Macedonians. And he had the shoeshine business really from the late 1920s into the early 1930s. And this was, again, a segue into more entrepreneurial endeavors. But unlike many Macedonians, my great-uncles and my grandfather decided to go into the restaurant business. And that was something that, and I'm so glad that Lillian Petrov had mentioned about how different cultures had an affinity for different kinds of businesses. Well, my Macedonians had an affinity, I guess, for the restaurant business. So by the early 1930s, they had sold the shoeshine business, and they opened up the first of a few Queens restaurants. There were only one Queens at the time, but they would go on over the next 20 years to have, I think, 3 different restaurants, all named Queens. They really liked the name Queens. So the first Queens restaurant was located in the first one was at Queen and Jarvis and Dundas, and it would be followed by another restaurant of the same name in the Beaches area. So they closed the first one. Actually, the first one had a fire of suspicious origins, and the second one, Queen's Restaurant, they opened near Q Beach in the Beaches area. This is my picture of my dedo at the first Queen's Restaurant in the 1930s. We don't have a lot of pictures from that period. Unfortunately, many of them were damaged over the years, and actually he tried to restore some of the pictures, but unfortunately they didn't survive the restoration back in those days. So this is one of a very precious photograph of my family, because it shows, because we don't have very many pictures from that period, but this is him behind the counter at the first Queen's Restaurant at Dundas and Jarvis. Yes. Well, Dedo always wore a suit, huh, Paul? From always, even around the house, it was like shirt and tie. And so this was not uncommon. Right into his My dad lived until the age of 90, and until the time that he was hospitalized, always, always with the suit, always the businessman, and very, very, very clean-cut in appearance. Never had a beard, never had a beard. Always hair combed.
Looks like collecting the money only.
Yeah, well, it could be. You've got, I know, the cigarettes behind you, and that's him at the Queen's restaurant. He would have been in his 30s by that time, in his mid-30s. So one of the things about members of my family is that my last name is Thomas, which is not Macedonian at all. But our name has undergone a number of transformations in the early part of the 20th century. Like many people from Aegean Macedonia, my family members had to change their names in order to be granted passports. So he left after Greece in 1927, and on his Greek passport it appears, I'm not sure what his first name would have been, but it was Jugloff. So he immigrated as Jugloff, but almost immediately dispelled with the Jugloff as soon as he arrived, and declared, was living under the name Jugloff. In the early 1930s, however, like many Macedonians, he changed his name along with his two other brothers. By the time the Shoeshine business was sold, my Chicho Nako, who was one of the original brothers, had returned to Macedonia. So just now, Norman and Spiro remained, and all three of them changed their name to Thomas. They were advised if they wanted to get anywhere in the city of Toronto, which, keep in mind was very English at the time, that they would have to change their name. So they changed their name to Thomas. Now, how do you get Thomas from Jugloff? It's quite a stretch. The name Thomas actually comes from my great-grandfather's first name, which is Atanas. So the name Atanas was mentioned in some discussion, and they decided to adopt that and anglicize it to Thomas. So that's why my last name is Thomas. Jugloffs, they came after the Greek Civil War. They have retained the name Jugloff. They immigrated with the name Jugloff, and that's why we have several Jugloffs that are indeed Jugloffs. Sadly, my dedo was married prior to his departure from Macedonia. He had married a young girl in Vamba, around the same age as him. The intention was that, as was for the case for many grooms, that he would go to Canada, establish himself, and then eventually bring her over. Sadly, she passed away from acute appendicitis, so she died, and they never saw each other again after he left Macedonia. In 1937, though, a few years after my dedo's first wife had passed away, my grandfather and my grandfather met at a picnic in the summer of 1937. And so within about 6 months they were married, and so this is their wedding photograph. This is a gem also. It's the reception hall agreement for booking the hall where the reception took place. By then they were established as Thomases, but there's some question whether or not the name was ever changed legally, or they simply self-described and declared themselves as Thomas. But this is a copy of the rental agreement for the hall. They all lived together on Claxton Boulevard. If anyone knows Claxton Boulevard, it's just off of Bathurst Street and north of St. Clair Avenue West in Toronto. And they all lived at all the brothers, Naum and or Norman and Spiro and my grandfather all lived with their wives at 36 Claxton Boulevard in Toronto. Apparently the house is still standing today, but after my father was born in 1938, they decided that the house was getting a little bit too small for all couples to be living together. But we know that it was very common for families to live communally like that back in those days. So my grandfather and grandmother bought a house in the Swansea area of Toronto, which is just west of Hyde Park. And when the people on Verbena Avenue found out that their new neighbors were Thomas, they were quite okay with that until they found out that my grandfather was an immigrant, and at which point they began a petition to not allow them to move into that house. They were unsuccessful though, and so my grandfather was the first real immigrant to live on Verbena Avenue in Swansea. But I also mentioned that he was also the first person with a Cadillac on the Verbena Avenue in Swansea, which I'm sure ruffled a few feathers. So over the years, my Bob and Deadlo gave birth to 3 children. My dad, Jimmy, who's on the right, he was born in 1938. My Aunt Catherine on the extreme left, she was born in 1940. And my Aunt Janet, who was born in 1947. So they all, for the first years of their life, well, although my father and my Aunt Catherine were first born when the family was living on Claxton Boulevard, but my Aunt Janet was born when the family lived on Swansea, on Verbena Avenue. So what were the expectations of girls and boys? Well, there's a quote from my Baba. Yeah. So that's the way it was. According to my aunt, she never saw my dad pick up a dish all throughout her childhood. But that, I'm not sure how common that was in young Macedonian households, but the girls had a lot of more household responsibilities, and maybe the expectations of boys were a little bit different back then. So despite the fact that, now my Baba was not actually, she was not born in the old country. My Baba was actually born here in Toronto, and she was actually a very proud Canadian, but also extremely proud of her roots. Her background was Macedonian on her father's side, from Zelenic, and her mom was actually Austrian. So her parents had met here in Canada, and she was born here in Toronto in 1914. So despite the fact that my Baba was not born in Macedonia, they did do many things to help maintain the Macedonian culture. So they were always involved in activities regarding the Macedonian church. They went to St. Cyril's and Methodi. They also went to a lot of social gatherings, mostly centered around the Macedonian community. And they also sent the 2 eldest children, Jimmy and Catherine, to what was then Bulgarian school, Macedonian school, for language lessons. And of my grandmother's family, her father was Macedonian, originally born in Istanbul. But in her house, even though her parents were immigrants, I think there was a certain stigma against the parents who wanted the children to communicate in English and to assimilate to Canadian culture. So there was mostly English spoken in the home. But my Baba did take it upon herself to learn the Macedonian language perhaps a little bit more aggressively than her siblings. So my grandmother actually used to speak a mixture of Macedonian and Bulgarian because she would have some Bulgarian words and my dad would correct her, and then she would use some of his dialect, Vambel dialect, and she would correct. They would correct each other and stuff like that. And my aunt was the one who spoke the systematized Macedonian from the 1940s. So most of the involvement was through the original Macedonian church. My grandparents were married at St. Cyril and Methodi, and there are other Canadian involvements. My dad, as I mentioned to Pete earlier, was apparently the very first president of St. Clements of Ohrid Macedonian Church, first Canadian born, that is. Others preceded him, but he was the first Canadian born. My dad was a very proud Canadian, but also a very proud Macedonian. And he did much to participate in the Macedonian community, despite being born in Canada. It's important for the kids, first and foremost, to respect parental authority. So they did respect their mom and dad implicitly. And also to work hard at school and at home. They were all expected to get very good grades and do well in school. Also to get an education. My grandfather was very big because he didn't have a formal education, but he did okay for himself, but also was very adamant that his kids got a good education, and used to tell my brothers and I that we better become engineers or lawyers or doctors or something like that, because again, that was very an important aspect for him. And also, all the family worked in the family restaurants. My grandfather did have a series of restaurants, one after the other, spanning right from the 1930s right until the late 1960s. So with the last one being the Food Fair restaurant around James Street and Nobay and Bloor area of Toronto. So it was, there was a very strong expectation that after school you'd work in the restaurants. My dad did that virtually every day after school in addition to doing his homework. Here's my Baba and Delo around 1992. My Delo passed away in 1994, and my Baba died in 1998. And of the original family, their children, only my Aunt Janet survives. My dad passed away in 1978, and my Aunt Catherine passed away in 1980. So it's just my Aunt Janet that survives from their marriage. But over the years, after the initial immigration wave of Jugloffs from Vumbel, other Jugloffs came as well from Vumbel, particularly after the Greek Civil War period, where there was an entire wave of Jugloffs that left Vumbel and really abandoned it because it really ceased to exist in the 1950s and was completely razed to the ground by the Greeks during the Greek Civil War. Many were refugees in many different parts of Europe and were finally reunited in Canada in the 1950s. And these members of the family, as I alluded to earlier, do retain the name Jugloff. So that's why you have just a few families here that are Thomases. We have some Jugloffs and some Zugloffs, some that spell their name with a Z rather than a J. So we're all related somehow, but we're all members of the same family. And I think that's it. Any questions at all about Jugloff immigration? Peter?
I think it's very important that we stress that your mother is not Macedonian.
No, my mom isn't Macedonian, isn't either. We're not very pure Macedonian.
What I want to add to it, she's been a very wonderful person. She's known her throughout the years, and she's been very, very, very cooperative with us as Macedonians.
Mm-hmm. My parents knew Pete and Mary back in the 1960s, and they used to come over to Burlington to the farm where my dad and my mom lived with my grandparents, Bob and Delo. Mary?
Can I just say a few words? When they were out on the farm, Jim had control of sheep. He raised sheep. And he'd be very active in shearing them too, how to shear a sheep and how to get the wool from the sheep. And the mother would come out. Catherine was an elegant, she had a beautiful mother there, grandmother. And I'd come out and Vanka would come out, Yatia Pakumaniska Tapato, he used to make me laugh with the saying. We'd go out there and see them. And then when Jim and his wife Olga, you moved up to the island, we lost contact with them for about a year. And then when we heard the explosion happening, and he died from some fire around the farm, but he had over 100 sheep up there, and he was a beautiful school teacher. And when he was at the church at St. Clement, I was the active secretary there to help Jim, and I got to know him very, very well. And I was very proud to have known your father through the church and through your parents, beautiful family that you had. Thank you.
Well, thank you ever so much, Mary.
I'd like to add something to Jimmy. Your father was, we entertained them at our restaurant a few times, and so my husband was involved with the Liberal Party, and he said, Jimmy, he said, the Liberals are looking for active people from the Macedonian community to take part in the coming election. He said, I'm sorry, I can't, I'm a new Democrat.
Oh, really? You know something, Sorga? Well, thank you so much for that insight, because I've never known about my father's political, I knew he's not right, I knew he wasn't right-wing, but I didn't know about his political issues. So thank you for that. And thank you, Mary, for those very kind words and and sharing your memories.
About 20 or 30 Macedonians, about 20 Macedonians there. And Jim Saunders was president of the group called the United Macedonians. And Spiro and the others get together and say, Pete, we want you to join the organization. We're going to make you the executive secretary. But he insisted, in their minds, the executive secretary wasn't the executive secretary. Executive secretary to them meant the executive director. So from 1960 to 1970, I was the executive director of the United Macedonians. In that period of time, we had the earthquake, we had the flood relief committee, and incidentally my wife Mary was active on raising funds for both of these. At the same time, we invited a delegation from Macedonia to come here, and we started the Macedonian Orthodox Church. And when we started the Macedonian Orthodox Church, shortly after, Mary became the first president of the ladies section of the Macedonian Orthodox Church, and subsequently I became the director at least 4 times. In 1970, we had an international conference at the Inanna Park. At the international conference, we had people from all over the world, including a famous author by the name of Noor Jani, who wrote about Macedonian history, and he came to the conference at the Inanna Park, and we formed what was called the United Macedonians of North America. But by the same token, we had a division within our own group, and there was a split that took place that was calling itself the United Macedonians of Canada. The split that took place then, the United Macedonians of Canada, which is the organization that exists today, carried on, and the United Macedonian Diaspora, I believe we have a representative here, had its origin or the concept, what was started then, a long time ago. Mary, by the same token, I think it should be mentioned that she and Milja Nikolowski and Anton Pavlov were the founders of the Macedonian program Makedonski Glas, which you still have today. They were the ones that started. Mary became the first president of the ladies section, and in 1989, we got a letter from the Macedonians in New York City, from Columbia University, telling us that there was a conference being held at Columbia University on Macedonian history, but no Macedonians were invited. So I was asked then to if I could write a letter to see why the Macedonians weren't being invited. I wrote a letter to the president of the Columbia University, and we got a reply back from the university that said, we didn't even know about the conference. So they said, you're welcome on behalf of the university, you can send your delegation. So we can't change the conference itinerary, but what we will do is we will give you all the respect that is due to you as Macedonians. So we called a meeting, and in calling that meeting, I was delegated to represent the Macedonian delegation. And there were three of us. I was one, the other one was Bill Jugloff, and the third one is, what's her name? I can't think of it. But there were three of us from Toronto. We went to New York City, and there was a delegation of about 30 or 40 Macedonians, at least, waiting for us to represent the Macedonians. And when we went to the conference at Columbia University, we had our own table outside with Macedonia, and one of the girls was dressed up in a Macedonian costume. We had Macedonian literature as well. The Greeks didn't like that. But on the other hand, we did go there, and we made a fair representation. And in coming back, we called a meeting in Toronto here. We had three meetings, really. The third meeting resulted in what I suggested then was the formation of the Macedonians representing all of Macedonia in Canada, the Federation, excuse me. And that's when a federation was formed, and John Jugloff offered to give his services. The meeting was called, it was held at his place, but under his direction, and we found that most of what we wanted to do initially was changed, and the Federation then came under the group that he appointed. Now, while the Federation still exists, and I believe personally there's a need for it, there's a need for it to represent all the organizations, and not just individuals, but organizations officially, so that we have a proper representation of who we are, and not just a haphazard one. So, I believe that more or less brings everything up to date as to where, who, why, what. But the important thing that I'd like to leave with all of you is that my father came to this country as a boy. He became educated in this country, and he became as much an American as everybody else did. They are what makes this country. He was an American. We are what makes this country as Canadians. What makes this country is the need for looking for those that are in need and helping them to survive and improve and add to what we have. Not for those that have it and say, I want more. Thank you very much.
Questions for Pete?
Who are those brothers?
Oh,
Yeah, Pete, you didn't mention.
where's the pictures? Oh, here we are. Well, that fat guy next to the angel there is me. Luke Handel on the end, and there's my brother John, and that's my brother Bill. Bill, by the way, was the chief engineer at Ford's, and John was in electronics. We're both World War II veterans.
Engineer, and all in that same kind of profession then, really? Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much, Pete. And it's interesting learning about, because he came to us to Canada, actually, from America, and that's a different aspect. I also want to say, by the way, in reference to something that Lillian had said about women organizing things, I want you to know that everything that you see today and how everything has been organized has been the two Thomases. They have done a fantastic job. I am very impressed. They have set up all the technical part of it, interviewed the people, scanned their photographs, etc. And this is the second time we've had this symposium. And I am very impressed with the kind of work that both John and Paul have done as far as organizing this. And I think that we owe them